I can recognize that a lot of their protests, a lot of their political movements, have been just trying to get attention. And there's a terrible hollowness to that, even when you really sympathize with the cause. And what does it draw attention to? It simply draws attention to the fact that there is a problem. And I think this is a classic case of the cart before the horse, the chicken versus the egg. People tend to engage in these protests, in these attention-getting behaviors, at a stage when all they want to do is scream from the rooftops, scream in the face of public indifference, there is a problem. And I think implicitly they assume if more people knew, simply by knowing, simply by getting that attention, the government would solve the problem, or ordinary people would rise up out of their seats and solve the problem. And the reality is that's not when you should engage in protests. That's not when you should engage in these kinds of agit-prop, public education, outreach, various forms of outreach and public education behavior. I think the reality is you only take that step when you're not drawing attention to the problem, but when you're drawing attention to the solution. This video is about the contrast between getting attention and building a meaningful movement. We're talking about the vegan movement, the future of the vegan movement. This really builds on the video I uploaded earlier today. In case you can't guess, the sun is now set. I'm recording this quite a few hours later, but in the same day. In that earlier video, I discussed the fact that there is hard social science research inquiring into the question of how effective or how ineffective it may be to simply hand out pamphlets to people if you're trying to promote an idea that's as new and unfamiliar and challenging to people's values and received opinions as veganism, right? Handing out pamphlets for veganism is not the same thing as handing out pamphlets for a new brand of shampoo. You're not really asking people to sacrifice anything to try a new brand of shampoo. They're already buying shampoo, and you're just trying to get them interested in trying something slightly different that might be a little bit better or might be a little bit cheaper or might be better for their health, whatever your sales pitch is for the shampoo you're promoting, right? Veganism is very fundamentally different than that. You're asking people to read this pamphlet and then look at their own grandparents and say, you were wrong. Everything you taught me was wrong. Everything you taught me about what being healthy means, Grandpa, was wrong. And for most of us, that's true. A tiny percentage of vegans alive today had vegan grandparents. Most of us grew up with our grandparents really trying to instill in us values about how we treat animals, about how we treat human beings, and indeed about our diet and health that we now have to recognize as wrong, both in the sense of being incorrect, misleading, ill-informed, bad for your health, and morally wrong. Immoral, right? That's a big turning point for many of us in our lives. And on this channel, I've had many videos talking about the agony of activism, so to speak, right? But this is not the kind of turning point people often make in response to a pamphlet, whereas trying a new brand of shampoo may be, and there's been a huge amount of social science research into how effective pamphleting is in promoting new products. There are all kinds of industries that are interested in answering that question and measuring that outcome because they're spending money, trying to make money, handing out pamphlets, right? So I've already provided an article inquiring into the hard science, the hard factual basis for whether or not handing out pamphlets is a waste of time. I'm going to kick off this video really as a segue into this topic, but just appealing to your common sense for a minute here. If I'm giving you a pamphlet for a live music event, for a festival, for a concert, let's say a rapper is coming to town. Lil B is coming to Halifax. Lil B is coming to Vancouver. Okay, Victoria, let's say, a smaller town, okay? If you take that pamphlet, what kind of person is going to respond positively to that pamphlet and make the decision, which is a relatively trivial, casual decision, to spend some time and money coming out to hear a live music event? Who's going to pick up that pamphlet and say, oh, Lil B, I've never heard of him. I've never heard of this artist before. Why should I come to this conference? That person is not going to even make the commitment, although trivial, to go and hear this live act, right? Somebody gets the pamphlet and looks at it and says, rap music? What's rap music? Or looks at the pamphlet and says, Lil B, sorry, is that a country musician? What kind of music does he play? Is this dance hall? Is this reggae? You know, someone who is at that level of totally lacking familiarity with the concept of what you're presenting them with, in a sense, that pamphlet is a wasted pamphlet. Now, somebody else might take the pamphlet and immediately they see the name and they think of a song. They already have something associated with it in their minds that may be positive, may be negative. Oh yeah, I've heard this guy before. I've heard of this guy. I've heard his music. I know what kind of genre he sings. I know what kind of crowd is going to be there. I know socially what kind of scene this is going to be. All right? That person, when you give them the pamphlet, they may or may not get curious, but at least it's an option. They might be interested. Oh, on Saturday, I might be interested in this. I might be interested in going to see Little B. In the same way, when we're talking about the effectiveness of pamphleting, education, and outreach, in my former video earlier today, I talked about the fact that an incredibly small percentage of the people to whom you give pamphlets are going to react positively. But it's also true that of the people who react positively, a very, very small percentage of their decision is going to be made by that pamphlet. Right? If you look at any major life decision, religious groups hand out pamphlets and say, convert to this religion. It's both the case that a very, very small percentage of people they give pamphlets to will make that decision. But of the people who do you really think the pamphlet was decisive? Do you really think the pamphlet was 90% of the information that went into making that decision? I think they took that pamphlet and then did a lot of soul searching, got some other source of information, talked to some of their friends and relatives, whatever the process is. And again, that's real social science research, whether you do it under anthropology or political science. You can talk to people who join cults or join new religions, people who convert and deconvert, and what was the process that went into making that decision. A pamphlet might be part of the process, but I think in every single case, it's a small part. And I knew one guy who became vegetarian, not vegan, because he was handed a pamphlet and read it. But still, I do think there's a lot more to that. And you sit down and talk to someone about that, all kinds of things come out. Their childhood experiences, concerns they'd had long before they'd seen that pamphlet, and things they looked into and read about after they got the pamphlet. This is human reality. Okay? Getting attention is not a bad thing in itself. I think the problem is that we're looking at so many social movements or aspiring social movements in veganism where getting attention has become the entire focus and purpose of the group. The group is designed for and spends all of their time and energy just trying to get attention. And in some cases, because I've now researched this, now read about this a fair bit, in some cases, I do think that the groups are doing that because they sincerely believe that all it takes is getting someone's attention. All it takes is handing them a pamphlet to change their lives forever. And that's a kind of missionary zeal. I'm not saying this to hate on them. In some ways, that's kind of sweet and touching, that they really believe that if only these people knew what I know, if only they found out about veganism from somebody handing them a pamphlet explaining these basic facts, then they would change their whole lives forever in an instant, in a heartbeat. That is one element of it. I do think there's a more cynical element of people who are chasing fame and chasing money. And, money is not evil, but they're thinking, if only we could get on the news, then a whole bunch of donations would come in. And definitely, even, again, you look at a group like Direct Action Everywhere, why is it that they so desperately want to be on the TV news, whether it's good or bad? Is it a desire for fame? Is it a desire for notoriety? Do they think that by getting arrested, what good is going to come out of that, being on the TV news for 30 seconds? Or is it getting donations? Some of the people, as I say, really sincerely believe that all it takes is getting someone's attention, like appearing on the news, giving them a pamphlet, to spark that radical ethical change, lifestyle change, and to have someone convert to veganism. So there is some of that going on. It's not all fame whoring. And I say also, I'm not perfect. We're talking about how ineffective pamphlets are. I'm now putting time and money into creating a storybook about veganism, a storybook for children, a book that parents can sit down and read to kids. Now, in the same way that I've just talked you through, who can really respond positively to that pamphlet? Only somebody who has some prior positive association. They see the pamphlet, they see the name of the artist, they know the music, or they know something about the music. They've heard it, they've heard of it. In the same way, I think you can really say my storybook, I put a lot of effort. I wrote it in Chinese, translated it into English. Other people translated it into German and Russian. It could be a great project. I've now got an artist on lock. We're going to illustrate this and publish it. Okay? It's going to be beautiful. Already the story is beautiful. The illustrator does great work. I've posted her Instagram before. She's got drawings up. Okay? But I think it still is susceptible to the same criticism. If you show that storybook to someone, if you read it to someone, a child or an adult or what have you, it can only really have a positive outcome for someone who already has some kind of positive association, some kind of prior knowledge, or just some prior reason to be curious, where they think, oh, veganism, I want to know more about that. You give someone the pamphlet for a rock concert, for a hip-hop concert. Oh, Lil B, I want to hear more of his stuff. I've heard some of his songs. I want to know, or I want to know one of his concerts. I want to know who else is going to show up. Maybe you're interested in the other people who are going to be there, not just the music. Whatever the reason is, there has to be already some sincere engagement that leads to curiosity. Curiosity leads to inquiry. The inquiry leads ultimately to action, to some kind of engagement, wanting to make the world a better place, wanting to change your own life. And I've mentioned this before. So my father, who's now deceased, haven't yet made a video talking about that. But, one of the very few, I think, original ideas my father tried to impress on me was the difference between learning an attitude. And an attitude can include just appreciation for something, appreciation for some facts, as opposed to learning facts, factual learning. And my father pointed out that you'd have huge government projects, public education projects, and museums costing millions of dollars, where sometimes the only message they're trying to get across is, like, this period of history exists. These people exist. Like, the government wants you to appreciate there used to be native people who lived here, and now they're extinct. And this is who they were. And this is, they didn't just live in a tent. They lived in these kinds of buildings. There weren't just 10 or 20 of them. This is their total population. This is the story of how they disappeared from the face of the earth. Most people, again, obviously I'm alluding to real examples here, where governments are trying to kind of do right by people who've been exterminated by European colonialism or other colonialism, miscellaneous non-European colonialism, as the case may be, where they know people are going to come and see this, or they're going to get this message through propaganda, through public education, through museum programs, or what have you, museum outreach. And the only thing they're really going to walk away with is a vague appreciation that these historical events happened at all, that these people existed at all. And a tiny minority of their audience is going to have the curiosity, the engagement, or the interest to really dig into the facts. Oh, what century did that happen in? Oh, what period is that artifact from? There's no point in designing your message or delivering your message in a way that presumes your audience is populated by specialists. You can imagine this is a huge problem with something like a museum project or a public education project, because most of the experts you're employing are career academics, and they're used to going to an academic conference where they present their findings to a tiny, tiny audience of people who have a specialized interest, saying, no, that's not what we're doing here. We have to learn how to present this history to an audience that's completely ignorant and completely indifferent, right? So you see why I'm mentioning this. This is like presenting a pamphlet to someone who's never even heard of veganism. Presenting a pamphlet to someone who's never even heard of Lil B. They've never even heard of rap music. These are the kinds of questions we get into. Okay? So getting attention in and of itself is not evil. However, I do see the extent to which it seems to warp the standards and practices of many of the aspiring leaders in the vegan movement, put it that way. Direct action everywhere, I see much of what they have done in the past as really being warped by a mad desire to get coverage on TV. And they didn't care if the coverage was good or bad, positive or negative. And they proudly would post, clips. Oh, we got on Channel 7 News. And, the fact that the news broadcaster is saying a bunch of idiots stood up in a Whole Foods market and, weeping and screaming, protested the fact that Whole Foods is selling turkeys on Thanksgiving, just like they did last Thanksgiving, just like they're going to do next Thanksgiving. This kind of theatrical, highly emotional, disruptive protest, there's no interest in what the reception is by the channel or what the perception of the audience is. They run out onto the field at a baseball game and they're hauled off the field in 30 seconds. They just want the attention. So it's interesting. I don't think seeking attention is negative in and of itself, but it is interesting to me how that can have a kind of corrosive effect on what your whole organization is doing. And one of the corrosive effects is simply that it forces you into short-term thinking, chasing headlines instead of building a meaningful movement, worrying about meaningful engagement, public education, outreach, and even your finances, even building trust with your donors where they're giving you money and they really understand what kind of outcomes that money is having. Because ultimately, none of these foundations can operate without money. None of them live on air and water alone. Lifestyle activism, I have many, many videos now, most of them more than a year ago. I don't think it's evil to put on a bikini. If you look beautiful, I don't think there's anything wrong with capitalizing on your beauty. But again, across the board, we've seen mixed messages within veganism that mixed, lifestyle, beauty, weight loss, etc. And really came up basically their program got warped, to use the same term I was using before. They went into a sort of dead-ended and fruitless pursuit of vanity and, Instagram followers and what have you. And I think, this is almost a universal rule at this point. I noticed Dr. McDougall, I don't even know the guy's first name, the starch-based solution guy, the starch solution, that McDougall, John McDougall. He tried to get a beauty and lifestyle magazine going. Obviously he was only one of the people on the board of directors. He wasn't editor in chief or anything. But you can see some funny outliers like that. You can see some funny examples where legit vegan activists or even medical professionals decide they're going to try to do something with bikinis and beaches and people living the good life. And then you look at it at the end and say, what did this magazine accomplish? She took donors' money and printed this magazine, and what are the real outcomes here? Maybe worse, maybe less than handing out the pamphlets, right? And I've pointed this before several times in Skype conversations with other vegans. I've mentioned to them how enormous PETA's budget is for their magazine, People with Ethical Treatment of Animals. And when you look at their justification of their budget, publishing that magazine is a huge part of it. They have a multi-million-dollar magazine, PETA. And I asked them, have you ever seen the magazine? Have you seen it around? Have you seen it in a dentist's office? Have you seen it at a friend's apartment? Because most of us are vegan. Our other friends are vegan. You know what I mean? Have you ever seen this magazine sitting around? And their answer is no. And then I asked them, well, look, if I gave you just $3 million a year, what do you think you could put together? So, again, I'm using examples. Some are headline grabbing. And some, I guess these magazines, whether it's McDougall's magazine or PETA's magazine, I guess the point is to sit there on a grocery store shelf, but the real outcomes are dubious. So again, lifestyle activism, the reason why people get trapped in it, I do think, is this issue of getting attention. As soon as your organization, whether that's 5 people making a social media presence have for lifestyle activism or 50 people making a magazine, what have you, I think as soon as you're chasing that short-term thrill of we got 10,000 thumbs up on this, whether it's an Instagram post or a video or what have you, I think that becomes profoundly distorting. And maybe you did start off with a mixed message where you say, okay, we're gonna promote ethical veganism and a certain kind of diet, and you're gonna put together this total package. But the question of what actually gets rewarded, what actually gets attention, if your purpose is to get attention, whether you're conscious of it or not, you may be measuring short-term success in terms of attention. I think, again, almost universally, I can't think of any example of a hybrid, lifestyle activism approach that has been successful or that has even stayed on topic. They've all really quickly kind of strayed away from their original purpose and disintegrated. And I guess, the ultimate example of this is PETA itself, People with the Ethical Treatment of Animals. In the last, I did an hour-long video with Mod Vegan, and we talked a lot about PETA, but the main purpose is it's a review of the final book from Gary Francione. I refuse to pronounce his name Francione, by the way. It's a terrible mispronunciation. I'm half mispronouncing it. Francione. But, come on, bro. I mean, I'm a member of the club of people who have names that are hard to pronounce. But come on, Francione. It's not Francione. But I digress. Anyway, in that hour-long video with Mod Vegan, we do talk a lot about P.E.T.A. And, there actually are a lot of things we have to give P.E.T.A. credit for. But we forget. And we forget partly because they had this mixed lifestyle activism approach. A lot of their stuff has been women in bikinis. It's been, these sexy photos and so on. And they got attention. I think they also destroyed P.E.T.A.'s credibility in the movement to a large extent. To an extent to which most of us just don't think about it. I just say I don't hate pornography. I don't hate bikini models. I really don't. But when you're talking about it, and you remind someone, oh yeah, but P.E.T.A. did this other project. That was really significant. They did this other thing. People are like, oh yeah, right. But you really got to dig. You really forget. You know what I mean? You forget about things you can give them credit for. They have this enormous budget, and what you see, maybe what you see is not what you get, but what you see is the attention-seeking, short-term thinking, headline-grabbing activities. It does indeed include bikinis and half-naked women saying they'd rather be naked than wear fur. You guys probably remember those campaigns. And that's become what we think of when we think of P.E.T.A. I don't know if they'll ever dig themselves out of a hole on that. All that naked women in the streets covered with fake blood. It is what it is. And I'm saying this with all due humility. I'm not going to tell you P.E.T.A. has nothing to offer the future of veganism. They have such a huge budget. In many ways, they still have a lot to offer. It's still a lot worth thinking about. But again, I can't think of any exception in the rule. We can look at that mixture of lifestyle activism and real advocacy and call it a success. And I think this is the reason why, is the short-term attention-getting behavior. Okay, so look, I'm challenging myself here by now using a couple of examples where I really do sympathize with the cause involved. I sympathize a lot with the struggles of First Nations people in Canada. First Nations, a.k.a. American Indians, a.k.a. Aboriginal or Indigenous people in Canada. The Cree, the Ojibwe, the Mohawks, etc., etc. I don't just sympathize with that a lot. I decided at one point to devote the rest of my life to working on language education and language extinction issues. And I enrolled at First Nations University and started learning Cree and Ojibwe, native languages in Canada. Okay? So it's something I sympathize with a lot. However, I can recognize that a lot of their protests, a lot of their political movements, have been just trying to get attention. And there's a terrible hollowness to that, even when you really sympathize with the cause. Because you see people who are sticking their necks out, and they may be doing great agitation and propaganda. I've been to protests that were beautiful, and they had native musicians playing the drums and chanting. And, they do get on the TV news, whatever the particular cause may be at the time. I've attended some protests like that. And it can be beautiful and moving, and it seems meaningful. But once they've got the attention, what can you do with it? Very often, the only message that gets across is First Nations are still unhappy. They're still protesting. They're still protesting something. And to give another, so that's an issue that has tremendous longevity built into it. Most of the people who are committed to First Nations politics can't quit. Some of them, if they do it as a job, they can never get any other job. They're locked in as activists for life. And other people, they're simply born with that racial identity in Canada, and they're attached to those politics for life. They have no choice, even if they might like to move on. And that's a big difference from veganism. It's a big difference from many other movements. So the second example I just want to kick out here where I sympathize, I've seen many, many different protest movements in Canada and Europe and elsewhere on the question of tuition fees, rising tuition fees, and whether or not the government should intervene, and how you should actually regulate the amount that university students have to pay for tuition. So I sympathize tremendously. And that's the opposite in this respect. One of the problems with that movement is that most people are only interested for a couple of years, and then they lose interest. So you have a constantly shifting and unsteady group of supporters, right? People are interested for a little while, and they lose interest and move on. I've seen some brilliant attempts at protest and simply organizing a movement under both headings, First Nations and lower tuition fees, or fighting against increasing tuition fees. There have been some brilliant and inspiring examples. There's one example from England where I remember this guy giving the interview, and I thought, wow, he's a really rare example of a guy who's got his head screwed on straight. He's got some great ideas. But I can only say that those movements succeeded in getting attention. And what does it draw attention to? It simply draws attention to the fact that there is a problem. And I think this is a classic case of the cart before the horse, the chicken versus the egg. People tend to engage in these protests, in these attention-getting behaviors, at a stage when all they want to do is scream from the rooftops, scream in the face of public indifference, there is a problem. And I think implicitly they assume if more people knew, simply by knowing, simply by getting that attention, the government would solve the problem, or ordinary people would rise up out of their seats and solve the problem. And the reality is that's not when you should engage in protests. That's not when you should engage in these kinds of agitprop, public education, outreach, various forms of outreach and public education behavior. I think the reality is you only take that step when you're not drawing attention to the problem, but when you're drawing attention to the solution. All right? And when you have a solution, it disciplines the whole group in a completely fundamentally different way. All right? If you just have a bunch of students who want to complain that tuition is too high, that's an amorphous and undefined group. If you have a group of students who say, okay, this is our solution. Here's our solution. We want to switch tuition to be a percentage of your income after you graduate. So after you graduate, you're going to pay 5% of your income to the university every year until you've paid back the amount of tuition. So if you graduate from university and you become a poet, maybe you have a very low salary, but 5% of that is going back, and maybe it takes you 50 years to pay back your tuition fee, but that's fine. If you finish university and you become a lawyer, you earn a lot of money, 5%, very rapidly, maybe you pay back your tuition. The vast majority of lawyers in Canada earn shockingly little money, by the way. It's a bad example. Lawyers earn a lot less money in Canada than you might think they do, especially for the first 10 years of their career, by the way. That's another story. Okay, so that's the plan. Now I'm not talking about protesting the problem. I'm talking about protesting for a solution. Not against the problem, but for a solution. And now a whole bunch of things are going to happen. Now instead of having a totally undefined group of students, some of them are left-wing, some of them are right-wing, they're just the only thing they have in common is that they're discontent about tuition being too high. Now you're actually putting together a group of students who have to ask themselves those challenging questions. Is this the solution? Is this the plan we're going to propose? And now you have a plan that you can take to Parliament, the Senate, the Congress, wherever you live, that you can take to the political system, that you can take to the political parties, that you can take to the university chancellor and say, look, we're not trying to take away money from you. We're not trying to bankrupt the university. What we want is for the government to enable a different style of payment plan. And the university is still going to make money and it's still going to flourish and there's still going to be academic freedom. But this is going to enable students to make more diverse career choices after they finish university because they're not facing crushing student debt the minute they stop attending class, which in Canada is our system, by the way. The minute you stop attending class, you have to pay back your student loans, and it is not as a percentage of your income. It's an absolute amount of money. I assume in America it's even worse. I don't really know. I'm not American. And again, with First Nations, it's easy. You can have a totally amorphous, broad-based group when you're protesting just for the problem. You're against the problem. You're just trying to get attention for the problem. When you have a particular solution, okay, this is our plan. This is our plan for how we want to solve, whether it's a land ownership issue or a water quality issue. There are a ton of those with First Nations, just getting access to drinking water, or how the education system for First Nations is organized and funded, or you want to reform corruption within First Nations government. This is the plan we're going to propose and we're going to protest for. Now, who's with me? And this is the last thing I want to say in this video. The greatest irony is that veganism really is a solution, not a problem. And yet I think we haven't taken advantage of this. What I see across the board are protests against fur, milk, meat, you name it. Protests, and again, I can sympathize emotionally. Protests that want to scream from the rooftops, scream in the face of public indifference about how terrible a given situation is. But the reality is we need to move forward into organizing a meaningful movement that is not designed to get attention. I think that warps everything you're doing in the movement, as with all these examples I've given. You need to move forward to being a movement that is arguing for and working for the solution, and is not defined in terms of the problem, and is not defined in terms of merely attracting public attention to the problem. Again, I'm not hating on people for doing it. I think that for many of us, the turning point is when we realize that drawing someone's attention to this, for the vast majority of people, is just as meaningless as giving them a pamphlet for a type of music they've never heard of before. They're not going to turn that corner, even for something as trivial as going to hear a concert for a type of music and a musician that they just means nothing to them. Okay? And the type of personal sacrifice, commitment, engagement, and again, even cultural change, looking back at your own grandparents, looking back at the traditions in your own family, in your own religion, your own culture, and suddenly seeing that as 10,000 years of error. That's a huge hurdle. And what all of us need to do, I think, first and foremost, is make better use of the human resources we've got, of the people who've already gotten over that hurdle. And again, start promoting veganism as a solution. Stop designing movements and outreach campaigns and protests that are merely about drawing attention to the problem. If you're vegan, it's easy to lose sight of how completely meaningless that is to 95% of the population when you put that pamphlet in their face.